That reading this morning reminds us when Jesus said that about keeping the Sabbath. If you circumcise on the Sabbath, that way the law of Moses would not be broken. Jesus is giving us an idea there of what it is, what was important to the people of Israel. They were keeping certain aspects that were important to them, and we as Christians can take a lesson from that today, in that we don't just want to keep what's important to us. We want to try to live as God would have us to live each and every day of our lives. If you will, I'd like to continue talking about some parenting. We've got probably one more lesson, and I may break it up for the kids' sake with a created creatures lesson next week, but I'd like to go ahead and talk about taking delight in our children. If you don't like children, it would probably be a good thing for you not to become a parent. I guess I've always been a child nut. I was the oldest of 8 children, and I took care of my little brothers and sisters, and even though I wasn't a parent at the time, you took delight in their accomplishments. I took delight in their accomplishments. I would take one of my sisters to the barn to milk with me when she was little, my sister Grace, and had a swing that Dad had built for her, and I'd put her in that swing, and she'd watch me milk, and I might rock her a little bit between milkings, and there were just times that I took great delight in my younger brothers and sisters. And as a parent today, I take great delight. There was a couple that used to come to church with my grandmother, and I guess like I said, always been a kid magnet. I've often wondered where this family is today, but they were from Payton City. They were related to the husband was the son of Bill and Dorothy Long, who's related to me very distantly. But they had a couple of children when they came to church with my grandmother, and they were really small at the time. But after church, I guess I was the bra growing up. They would when I go to church with my grandma, those kids would come up and reach up. I'd pick them up and I'd hold those kids. And the last I knew, that family was in Japan. I don't have any idea. I can't imagine they're still there. But taking delight in children is such a wonderful thing. And, it's something that we as parents should do, delight in our children. So I want to talk to you a little bit about taking delight in our children and enjoying the time that God has given us. It's not only something that we take delight in children, but God takes delight in us. We've been adopted into God's family. We are part of God's family. When we become Christians, we become God's adopted sons and daughters. And God delights in us, just like we delight in our children. When things are good, God delights in us. When things go bad, God reprimands us. But in Romans chapter 8 and in verse 15 of that chapter, the Apostle Paul writes, "For you did not receive the spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you have received the spirit of adoptions as sons, by whom we cry, Abba, Father." Now, I don't know about you, but, to see a little child going around saying mum, 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 or dad, 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 is one of the greatest things. And hopefully those are the first words a child learns to say, is mama or daddy. And they should bring a glint to our eyes. Just like when we say Father to God, or Abba, which means daddy in Hebrew language. And so God takes delight in hearing us call him his Father. And so it is when we hear our children calling us by name. I've got a couple of children who don't call me Papa, every once in a while, one of them to torment me calls me Poppy. Don't you, Emma? She knows I don't care for that, but she likes to call me Poppy. So if Emma likes to call me Poppy, I'll be Poppy. But, and every once in a while, a child calls me Father, and I look at, what did you do wrong? I don't go by Father, I don't go by Daddy very often, but Papa and Poppy I go by. And God takes delight in His children, and so we should take delight in our children. You know, I mentioned this morning in Bible class that our time is so short with our children. And I think that it would behoove all of us to be as involved as possible in our children's lives. And I'm preaching to myself as well as to anybody else this morning. The book of Psalms, David writes in Psalm 37 and in verse 23, the steps of a man are established by the Lord, when he delights in his ways. Though he fall, he shall not be cast headlong, for the Lord upholds his hand. You have been young, and now am old. I have been young, and now am old. Yet I have not seen the righteous forsaken, or his children begging for bread. He is ever lending, generous, and his children become a blessing. David is saying that God's children are a blessing. God catches us when we fall. You know, one of the things that I've noticed as being a parent is you always hurt for your children. You know, my children have been pretty fortunate as far as mishaps and falls and bumps. But, you know, yesterday Sarah got her hand stuck in the door of the van, and, you know, they pinched her fingers. And, you know, I see that redness and I hurt for her hands. You know, and there have been other times that, you know, you feel for your children. You know, one time Peter had a fever. I will never look at a fever the same again. He had a fever, and it was really high. Kate was holding him in the rocking chair, and he was little, and he went into a seizure and swallowed his tongue, quit breathing, turned blue. You know, I'm telling you, it was the scariest moment in my entire life. I had no clue what to do. I am medically challenged, if you will. The sight of blood nauseates me, and so he's blue, you know, and thankfully Kate knew exactly what to do, you know, to get his tongue pulled back out so that he was breathing again. But that struck a little bit of panic. I've never looked at a fever the same way. Never saw that before, never want to see it again. And so, you know, those times you catch your children when they fall. Sometimes you talk to them about things. You know, as my children get older, they're making preparations for life. And Ruth is trying to figure out, you know, what she's going to do, how she's going to go about life, you know, when she's out of school, which is crazy, but it's not but maybe 3 years down the road. And I know Dylan is looking towards the same sorts of things. Pamela's trying to help Dylan navigate these things. And so our children, as they get older, we navigate that road with them, and we try to direct their paths, but also we try to catch them when they fall, or pick them up, just as God does in Psalm 37 there. So in order, though, to do that, in order to be a parent, to meet a child's needs, to be able to catch them when they fall, we need to anticipate them when they're going to fall. Now, that's a different challenge altogether as a parent, is to anticipate them when they're going to fall. Look with me at what Jesus says here in Matthew chapter 19 regarding children. Matthew chapter 19, verse 13. Jesus says, then the children were brought to him that he might lay his hands on them and pray. The disciples rebuked the people, but Jesus said, let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for to such belongs the kingdom of heaven. And he laid his hands on them and went away. What I want you to think about is the tenderness with which Jesus dealt with the children present. And laying his hands on them, he took time for them. Time, I've said before, I'll say it again, time is the most valuable thing any human being possesses, because we did not set the beginning of our time, and we will not be able to dictate the end of our time. The psalmist says our days are numbered. And it's true. We don't know what the number of our days is. Something else that I've been thinking about, I'll be 42 this fall in September. My grandfather died at the age of 42. Now, I'm not saying I'm planning on dying, but it does, when you pass that. I know my two older cousins, my dad, his brothers, when they passed that age of 42, it was like, what's going to happen this year? There's a little bit of that apprehension in their minds. And I have to say, there's a little apprehension in my mind. You know, I do realize that there are things that are different in my life from my grandfather's, but I thought about it, what would happen if my children only remember me to the age of 42? How would they remember me? Would I have met their needs? Would I have been the father that they needed? Would I have cared enough to warn them about the pitfalls of life? One of the things that I enjoy about having teenagers is that we get to have almost adult conversations. There are times when I can now relate to my children on an adult level, where they're asking questions that are, not that my children ask stupid questions, okay? I don't want to imply that. They say there's no such thing as a stupid question. But sometimes my younger children, why is the sky blue? And I'm not my father-in-law. My father-in-law would have gone into great details to what made the sky appear to be blue. But I'm not my father-in-law. I'm like, because God made it blue. That's my general answer. So, if you've got a better answer for that, share it with me. And I'll tell my kids the next time one of the little ones says, why is the sky blue? I'll share the answer. But so we've had some really great conversations in the recent past with some of the older kids as they grow up and learn to navigate life. The conversation is very, very good. I want to look at what Solomon says in Proverbs chapter 6. As we talk to our children about life, we need to warn them about the pitfalls, the potential problem places in life, so that they don't make the same mistakes that we make. And I know that it's been said by people that when I was 6, Dad knew everything. When I was 16, Dad knew nothing. When I was 26, Dad was okay again. We make fun of that. But as parents, whether or not our children listen, and one of the things I've noticed is that they may not act like they're listening, but they really are. Our young people's minds are like a sponge, and they absorb things. Solomon in Proverbs chapter 6 and verse 20 says, my son, keep your father's commandment, and forsake not your mother's teaching. Bind them on your heart always, and tie them around your neck. Solomon's encouraging his son to remember the things that he's been taught. And our children tend to do that. They may not acknowledge that we're right. They may not acknowledge that we have information that they can use. Someday down the road, they're going to be in a situation and they'll remember something that mom or dad has told them. Solomon says, when you walk, they will lead you. When you lie down, they will watch over you. And when you awake, they will talk with you. And that certainly is true. There are times when we may be dead and gone, that our words will talk to our children years from now. Also, something we need to do is encourage our children to do what is right. Now, this can be challenging because our children want to live their own lives. But, this was something in Deuteronomy chapter 11. This is a fascinating passage that God told Moses to write down for the children of Israel. In Deuteronomy chapter 11, and in verse 18 of that chapter, Moses records for us what God is asking. He says, you shall therefore lay up these words of mine in your hearts and in your soul. He's talking to the children of Israel. Before they come into the promised land, they're to store up. Your King James Version might even say, to store up these words in your heart and in your soul. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. I would say maybe if Moses were talking to us today, instead of frontlets, Moses might say they might be tattooed on your hand and they might be as glasses on your eyes. That might be the wording that Moses would use in speaking to us today. But notice with me verse 19. This is very important, parents, because if we teach our children, Solomon in the book of Proverbs, remember we began this study, train up a child in the way he should go. When he is old, he will not depart from it. Most of what our children learn, most of what you and I learned, was learned at a very early age. We've expanded that knowledge, we've grown that knowledge, but our basic characteristic is formed before we're 6 years old, before we actually, even our school age, our basic characteristics are formed. Something that I appreciate, even though my dad was Catholic and I was raised in the Catholic Church, something I appreciated was my grandmother, who took time to do exactly what Moses is talking about here in verse 19. You shall teach them to your children. All of the ways of God you shall teach to your children, talking of them when you are sitting in your house, and when you are walking by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. Now, I don't know about you, but this sounds like a pretty constant reminder. And so we have tried our very best to talk about God with our children in all places, in all times, in all situations. When we go to play, we talk about God. You can talk about God in any situation. And children will retain that. They'll listen to that. Now, in verse 20, I love verse 20. Growing up, we had a neighbor who was really, really good friends with my grandmother. This lady had grown up in the church, but had drifted away from the church. She never became a Christian, even though she'd grown up in the church. Her husband was raised by a family that was not members of the church, and he studied the Word of God. He picked up the Bible one day and began to read, and he read this passage about the words of God. He says, you shall write them on your doorpost of your house and on your gates. Now, I'm going to pause there, and I want to tell you what Ray Franks did. And I never knew Ray Franks. He died before I was born, but I knew his wife, Edna. Edna Franks, she milked a small herd of dairy cattle until she was 88 years old. At the age of 88, she switched to beef cattle. She ran beef cattle for the next 4 years until she passed at 92. But I would go up there as a child, and I would help Edna milk cows. I loved helping Edna. It was before we were milking cows, so I loved helping Edna milk cows. And but something struck me to this very day. If you would go up to the Edna Frank's farm, the buildings that are still standing, every building at the gable had a Bible verse. Some of them were at the gable, sometimes over the door. Ray Frank's had little metal signs made up. And every building had a Bible verse that might pertain to that building. There was one on one building that said, is the passage regarding seed time and harvest. That was on the granary. There was another one that said the section in Psalms about the cattle on the 1,000 hills. You know, and on the gate to their house, there was a little metal sign. The gate to the yard, little metal sign. I don't remember what that one said. But I remember as a child, I couldn't read, but I'd point up and I'd say, what's that one say? And Edna would read it to me. She didn't become a Christian until she was 88 years old. At the age of 88, she obeyed the gospel. Her husband had been a Christian for years, and she had never obeyed the gospel. But one day, Edna was talking with my grandmother on the telephone. My grandmother had cancer, so it would have been about 1993. My grandmother had cancer, and they talked every day on the telephone. Edna would call, see how she was doing. And Edna, I remember hearing the conversation. She said, I wonder what the Lord is keeping me here for. All of my family's gone. My husband's dead. My parents are dead. My brothers are dead. My sisters are dead. She said, I just don't understand, Wyona. Wyona was my grandmother's name. She said, I just don't understand, Wyona, why the Lord is keeping me here. My grandmother said, well, Edna, there's probably something you still need to do. God's not through with you yet. She said, have you thought about becoming a Christian? And there was just silence on the phone. I was there a couple of days later when Edna called up again, and she began the conversation with, well, Wyona, I went and done. Grandma goes, went and done what? She said, I got baptized. I became a Christian yesterday. And I remember that conversation so well. And I remember the impact that her husband, even though I never met him while he was living, had on my life in this particular passage. So there are times and there are places where we can bring up God's word to our children, and it will leave a lasting impact. Maybe not even to our children, but other people's children. You know, attitude. It all boils down to where our heart is. The Bible says, Jesus says, where your heart is, there will your treasure be also. I just reversed that. Where your treasure is, there will your heart be also, is the way Jesus phrases it in the Gospels. Where is our treasure? As parents, is the most important thing to us that our children are equipped for life or for eternity? What's our attitude? What's our priorities? Look with me back in the book of Psalms again, this time at Psalm 127. I want you to see this. Psalm 127 is a beautiful psalm, and it regards home building. Now, the word house appears in here. But I want you to think of this as more than a structure in which we live, but a home. A home in which our family resides. Psalm 127, I'm going to read this whole psalm for you. The psalmist says, unless the Lord builds the house, those who build the house labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. It is in vain that you rise up early and go to rest late. Eat the bread of anxiousness, of anxious toil, for he gives to his beloved sleep. Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord. For the fruit of the womb, a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior are the children of one's youth. Blessed is the man who fills his quiver with them. He shall not be put to shame when he speaks with his enemies in the gate. I'm going to dissect that psalm a little bit. It's talking about our homes, not a physical house. It's talking about our children, and it's talking about us as parents. But unless, as the psalmist says here in verse 1, unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. What does the psalmist mean? Given the context, what is the house? I would entertain that the context, the house is the home, the family unit. Unless God builds a family unit, that family unit will not survive. Divorce, separation, run rampant in our society today. And it's because God is not building the home. God is not building the house. If we try to supersede God's laws by entering into a relationship with someone who's not a Christian, God's not building that house. You're not going to hold that house together. The structure will be weakened and perhaps fall apart. The same way, you can stay awake and you can watch for someone to steal something, to take over something. Those who watch a city, unless the Lord watches over that city, watchers can miss something. They could stay awake and it would not avail them anything. The builder of every home is God. And God does the work. Again, I want you to think about that. Rely on God. Don't rely on something that we study or something we read. I've read child psychology books. Ugh, that's some boring stuff, and there's some really bad information in some of those books. Some psychologists contradict other psychologists. So who do you believe? Believe in God. In verse 2, it says, "It is vain that you rise up early and go late to rest, eating the bread of anxious toil, for he gives his beloved sleep." Anxiety. You know what? Someone one time told me, I'll spare you the details, but I had a man one time in the church tell me, "Tom, you will never be qualified to become an elder." He goes, you have so many children. I only had 7 at the time. You have so many children. There's no way they're all going to be faithful to God. I pray he's wrong. But by being anxious about what those empty words could have brought me down. And in fact, it did kind of bring me down for a while. Kate put it this way one time. If my children don't become Christians, if my children go to hell, then my life has been wasted. And I think she's right. At the same time, there's no point in our being anxious over something that we cannot change. Keeping in mind what Moses said in the book of Deuteronomy, to keep the Word of God at the forefront of our lives, we're putting our children in God's hands. God doesn't want us to be anxious about raising our children. You know, there have been times where I've wondered how in the world we're going to manage. But God has always made a way for us to manage, to have happy, healthy children. Anxiety is taking God's concern and making it our concern. Anxiety is really a lack of trust in God, if you think about it. Because we're being anxious for something that we have no control over, only God has control over. And anxiety is really built on a lack of faith. So let's think about what the psalmist says right here in verse 2. "It is in vain that you rise up early and go to rest, or go late to rest, eating the bread of anxious toil, for he gives his beloved sleep. If we trust in God, we will rest. There's a story that was told about a farmer who hired a hired hand. And the hired hand, he asked in the interview, "What are your qualifications?" The hired hand said, "I can sleep at night." The farmer didn't understand what it was, but he didn't have a lot of options. You know, people today, there's more jobs than employees. So the farmer went ahead and he hired this man to work for him. And the following week, there's a severe thunderstorm coming. The farmer wakes up in the middle of the night. And he's going about. He goes out to make sure the barn doors are shut and the greenhouse curtains are shut and all this stuff that we have to worry about when a storm hits us up on the hill. Everything was done. Everything was put away. The doors were closed. And the hired hand was asleep in the bunkhouse. He'd done everything that was required of him, and he could rest easy at night. The farmer could have rested easy at night himself if he had had confidence in the one taking care of things. We can as well, because God takes care of us. Verse 3, "Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord, the fruit of the womb, a reward." What is a heritage? What is a heritage? Oftentimes we think of a heritage as something that has been passed down from generation to generation. Our children, my friends, are our legacy. The young people of this congregation are the legacy of this group of brethren. Our children will speak volumes about us in the future. Good or bad, they're our legacy. What is a reward? Children are a reward? That could be debatable. Or could it? I may not have a large retirement. I may not have a lot of insurance. When I get old, I don't think I'll have to worry about who's going to take care of me. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe nobody will want me. But I'm hoping they're fighting over who gets to take care of Papa. We'll see. Our children, do they fit a heritage? Do they fit a legacy? Do they fit a reward? Even if my children move away, far away, they'll still be my reward. Verse 4. I love this one. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior are the children of one's youth. Arrows. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever tried making arrows. I'll bet you Dylan has. Probably Colt has, probably too. When I was a kid, I used to take sticks, straighten those arrows out and try to make them, and inevitably they fly crooked. The children are just like arrows in the hands of a warrior. Now, I don't know about you, but if all I have is a bow and arrow to protect me, I want to make sure that I've got a bunch of arrows. I think there's something to be said here. I talked to a fellow one time. He had 2 children. Now, I'm not faulting anyone with 2 children. He said, my quiver's full. I thought to myself, wow, you better not find yourself in a great big battle with only 2 arrows. Anyway, that was when I was young and naive. Now that I'm older, I don't know. Maybe it makes more sense. What am I thinking? But But really, I think that's the connection. Children are not only our legacy, they're also, to a certain point, our purpose in life. Children are arrows, parents, a warrior. Seems rather odd to me. But what's the target? Maybe that's the real question. What is the target? Despite, no matter how many arrows you have or don't have, a warrior has an enemy or a target. Just get a visual of picking one of my kids up and pulling back a bow and shooting them. What are my children to be shot at? What's the target? And how serious are we about hitting that target? I don't do a lot of hunting, disclaimer. It's not because I don't enjoy hunting, it's just I never have the time for it, never make the time. Probably a fault of mine, but my boys enjoy hunting. They're always, can we take the gun out? Can we go rabbit hunting? It's not rabbit season. Okay, what about pigeons? Believe me, they can always find something to shoot. If it's not rabbits, it's pigeons. If it's not pigeons, it's groundhogs. I don't care what it is. They can think of something that they need to kill. They get very serious about this. One day they brought in a bunch of pigeons out of the barn and brought them into Kate, held them by the legs, blood dripping down the beak, Look, Mama, look what we got. And Kate's like, oh, get out of here, not in my house, please. And they're like, can we eat them? She's like, wait till your father gets home. What this is, it's always wait till your father gets home. So I get home, guess what? We had fried pigeon for supper. You know what? It isn't too bad. I'm not sure I would want to live off the stuff. It really isn't too bad. So what are we as parents? What are we aiming at? I think we're shooting for eternity. Our children, we're aiming as parents. We point them in the direction we want them to go. Sometimes, maybe we haven't done our job quite right, and they get a little crooked as they go out there. But we're pointing them towards eternity. Verse 5 said, blessed is the man who fills his quiver with them. I think mine's full, friends. I think my quiver's full. He shall not be put to shame when he speaks with his enemies in the gates. A man who is well armed is a man respected by his enemies. A parent who is well armed is one who is well supported by his family. I can't tell you how much encouragement my children give me on a daily basis. I don't have to think of topics to preach on. I'm telling you, between you guys, the written request, but more than that, my children come almost on a daily basis. One of my children comes, Papa, would you preach on? Usually it's some sort of created creature out there that they want a topic on. But sometimes there's something else. Ruth is wanting a couple of sermons right now on young adulthood. It's been so long since I've been a young adult, I don't know how to preach on that topic, but we're going to get there one of these days. A man whose quiver is full of children is going to have support in his old age. Again, why would a warrior want to have a bunch of arrows? I think that's a rhetorical question. And a quiver, everybody knows what a quiver is, right? It holds the arrows. I'm not sure how many more I can stuff in. And the last sentence here in Psalm 127. The English Standard Version says, he shall not be put to shame when he speaks with his enemies in the gate. Who's our enemy? Satan. When Satan tries to speak with me at the gate, whether it's the gate of this life, the gate of eternity, or at the gate of the day, you know what? If I didn't have all my children, I might be tempted to get into trouble. As it is, I have responsibility. I have to make sure that my way is God's way. I want you to think about your children maybe a little differently. Think about them as a heritage, legacy that you're going to leave behind. Think about them as arrows. And think about eternity as a mark. It's important that we prepare our children for life. But it's even more important that we prepare our children for eternity. The fall-off rate in the church is drastic. And not just within our brotherhood, but the fall-off rate in Christianity. I was talking to Trenton Hall yesterday. And he's buying a house. He's going to be preaching in Barnesville. He is preaching in Barnesville, Ohio. And he and his family are going to be moving to Barnesville, and they're purchasing a house in Barnesville. They're buying a preacher's house for right next door to the Presbyterian church. They're buying it off the Presbyterians. It's a block from the church building where he'll be preaching at, and where he'll be preaching is very blessed. They run in the mid-80s on Sunday mornings. The Presbyterians, they're in the mid-20s. Building holds probably 150 people. I've been by that Presbyterian church a number of times, and they're all old. It's only a matter of time until that church, like so many others, no longer exists. Our children, I cannot emphasize enough, our children are the future. They're the future of America, and they're the future of the church. If you're here today, maybe you're struggling in understanding what God expects out of you. The first thing God expects out of each of us and asks out of each of us is to be His child, so that He can use us like an arrow, so that He can aim us for eternity. We know the steps of salvation: to hear and to believe, to repent, to confess, to be baptized. Those are all familiar steps to us. So if you're here today and you've not gone through those steps, become a child of God. Allow Him to aim you at the mark. You won't miss if God's aiming the arrow. If we can help anyone this morning, we'll get your songbooks out and turn to 310. And make your wants and wishes known as together we say.